February 8th, 1587, it was right here, inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle, that a queen had her head struck off upon the orders of Elizabeth I, the final Tudor monarch. Mary Queen of Scots had been condemned to death for treason, and it took months for the English Queen, her cousin, to actually sign the death warrant. The execution did not go well at all, and what happened afterwards is rarely spoken about, but is incredibly shocking. Mary Queen of Scots' corpse was placed into a coffin and was just left here, up on the mound over there, inside of the castle, rotting, and it took months until the decision was made to finally bury her in a proper grave. And the decision to bury Mary may have been influenced by King James of Scotland, Mary's son, as he wanted his mother to have some semblance of a proper burial. He may have been exerting pressure upon Elizabeth to achieve this. The place where Mary was buried would not be her final resting place, inside of Peterborough Cathedral, around 12 miles from here. But why was Mary Queen of Scots given this rough treatment in death? She was a traitor after all, and was someone who lost her life in great shame, despite her standing as an anointed queen. What has never been done since the day that her burial took place is the journey of her coffin to the site of her burial. And today we are going to do that exact trip from the place of Mary's execution, right here, Fotheringhay Castle, to Peterborough Cathedral, stopping at some of the villages and sites where the coffin passed by. This is the funeral procession of Mary, Queen of Scots. On the evening of the 7th of February 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, former Queen of Scotland, was informed that she'd be executed the next morning. She spent her last hours in a room on the mound inside of the castle, writing and getting her last orders in a fair. And all of this was happening whilst the scaffold was being made in the Great Hall, which is right around here. Right here stood a grand room where banquets and much frivolity would take place. But on the 8th of February 1587, an execution took place, and Mary would have heard the sound of the scaffold being created, the wooden platform where the execution occurred. There was a lot of fanfare for her death. Officials had come from London to witness it on behalf of the Queen, and on the day of her execution she was informed that everyone was ready. Inside the Great Hall there was much black cloth draped to mark the occasion, and it was a rather dreary sight. Mary slowly processed into the room, accompanied by a couple of her ladies, servants, Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl. She walked through the ground and then reached the foot of the platform, and in theory this platform, the scaffold, had been made to give everyone a good view of the grisly execution. And it was most certainly grisly. Mary made her preparations, and she was wearing the colours of a martyr. The executioner was a man named Bull and his assistant, and they fell to the former Scottish Queen's feet and asked for her forgiveness. And Mary replied with, "I forgive you with all my heart for now. I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." And with this it was clear that Mary was ready to die. She'd lived in captivity for almost 2 decades, a prisoner of her cousin Elizabeth I, as she had been implicated in plots to oust Elizabeth from the throne, something the Catholics in England would have been joyous of, but traitors during the Tudor period and people who plotted the demise of a queen were brutally punished. Back in the Great Hall, Mary was blindfolded by her servant, Jane Kennedy, and then she knelt down on a cushion in front of the block. People held their breaths. The executioner stood with his axe and prepared himself. She uttered her final words. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." And then indicated to the executioner she was ready as she lay her head on the block. She then thrust out her arms to the side with her neck on the block, and the executioner crashed down his axe. but she was not beheaded with a single strike. The first blow from the axe missed her neck entirely and embedded in the back of her head. This could have been fatal. The crowd gasped and some even screamed, and the executioner separated the axe from her skull and then tried again. A second blow severed the neck and landed cleaner, but the head had not been fully taken off. The executioner then used his axe to saw through the last sinew, holding her head onto her shoulders. After this, the executioner held up Mary's head and actually dropped her head because she'd been wearing a wig. Anything that had been touched by Mary's blood was then burnt in the fire of the Great Hall as the executioner shouted, "God save the Queen." Now, this is where the journey of Mary's funeral procession begins, but Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, refused to have Mary buried. The truth was that she could not accept what had just happened, that she had executed an anointed queen, and Elizabeth believed for the rest of her life that she would go to hell because of this. Mary had asked to be buried in France, but this was rejected. Immediately after the execution, her body was embalmed. Her vital organs, such as her heart and lungs, were cut out of her corpse to keep away decay, and they were allegedly buried here. And it's believed that they still remain here somewhere today. Now, Mary was then left in a secure lead coffin until her burial would take place, so the remains were just left in a room, decaying and rotting. The funeral didn't take place until later in July, over 5 months after her execution. The coffin was taken from here to Peterborough Cathedral, so let's begin that journey to Mary's first burial site. Welcome to Elton, a small village of around 670 people today, found 7 miles southwest of Peterborough. This is a medieval village, and it's listed in the Domesday Book. It's just 2 miles from Fotheringhay Castle, where Mary Queen of Scots' execution took place. There would have been possibly a few hundred people, if that, living here during the Tudor period, most of them working for the lord of the manor, and they would be farming. Of course, little of what we would see today would have existed. The medieval buildings went a long time ago. Now, on the evening of July 30th, 1587, the Garter King of Arms and 5 heralds, along with 40 horsemen, arrived at Fotheringhay with a funeral car drawn by 4 large horses. The car was covered with black velvet and carried the arms of Scotland. The lead coffin of Mary Queen of Scots was placed on the cart, and this was then processed under the cover of nightfall from Fotheringhay, and this village of Elton was one of the first places that the coffin passed by. It was a torch-lit procession. The procession began around 10 o'clock in the evening, meaning that probably at 11 o'clock the funeral procession passed through here, Elton. Now, one thing to consider is that Mary's coffin had been placed into a lead coffin and was already showing damage and decay, and rough roads, if we can call them a road, would have caused further damage to the coffin. One account states of the procession that it must have been a weird scene in the dead of the night to anyone who chanced to see the torch-lit procession making its slow way along the country roads. So Elton was the first stop on the journey. This is Chesterton, which still today is a very small village. It would have been similar in the 16th century, and today there's just over 300 people who live here, and most of the surrounding villages are slowly being swallowed up by Peterborough as modern housing developments are made. This place actually has a rich Roman history. It was a farm settlement during the time of the Roman invasion, and there may have even been a Roman fort built in that direction. Another interesting fact, piped water may not have been installed here until 1939 and the outbreak of World War II, meaning the villagers still had to get their water from the local brook. And sewers weren't made here until 1969. The church here, St Michael's, would have been here during the time of the Tudors, meaning the funeral procession would have almost certainly have gone past this church. We're not far from Elton, and the procession would have gone through here around half an hour after. There may have been religious chanting going on as the coffin was pulled through the streets, and there would have also been many people who came out of their houses to see what was going on. The funeral procession wasn't announced at all. People didn't have social media or television, so they wouldn't have known what was going to take place. It's strange to think, standing here, what people would have witnessed that night. The coffin of the executed Scottish Queen making its way to its burial site. Now, with a little bit of modern research, looking at maps, it appears to us that the coffin of Mary Queen of Scots would have started at Fotheringhay and then gone church to church to church. People didn't have things like compasses or GPS, so a church spire, something big and grand, would have been easy to spot. So that's what they'd have followed, church to church to church, all the way to Peterborough Cathedral. Walton is a village of roughly the same size as Chesterton, yet again another medieval village that in the Domesday Book said there were 2 water mills and a fishery here where people obtained their food. It wasn't the most lavish place during the medieval period. It's got a church, an Elizabethan manor house, and the River Nen, which flows into Peterborough, and it goes through here. Now, that night of the procession, one thing to mention is that for a queen who died in disgrace and was executed, Mary was given a decent send-off. The procession being large was something expected for a queen, and Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, had wrestled with what to do with Mary in her conscience for some time. She even had a man thrown into the Tower of London for being involved in convincing her to execute Mary. So what Elizabeth tried to do to appease God, who she thought would punish her for the execution, was to give Mary a good send-off. But she wasn't buried in Westminster Abbey to start with. The decision to bury her to begin with inside of Peterborough Cathedral was simply logistics. It was the closest major city cathedral to where she was executed. Something that made sense. I wonder what the people thought who witnessed the procession. Did they cheer? Did they jeer? Did they shout angry statements at the coffin of a woman who had plotted the death of their queen? Right, on to Peterborough. Welcome to Peterborough. This is the bridge over the River Nen. After Walton, the coffin processed through Orton Waterville, Orton Longueville and Woodstone, and these places today have been swallowed up by the city of Peterborough. To be honest, they're just small boroughs of a major city. They were once villages, but I am stood here because we know for a fact that the coffin of Mary Queen of Scots passed over the bridge here, or, well, this is the site of the original bridge. This is the River Nen that flows from her place of execution right here. So could they have processed the coffin by barge? Probably, especially in summer, but the route over the road was quicker and easier. Now we know that the coffin travelled from that side of the river into the city here. Obviously the bridge has had alterations and changes over time, But this was where the coffin was brought into the city. This is where more people would have witnessed the coffin of Mary Queen of Scots. Today, this is the route that many take to enter the city. Now, upon entering Peterborough, the coffin was heading straight to the cathedral. This was a place where a queen had already been buried. The grave of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, still is in the cathedral, and she would have been interred under a large tomb. But this was smashed up during the English Civil War. So, let's get to that cathedral. Aren't cathedrals just magical? Look at the size of that. It's massive. Now, this place also had a bishop's palace, a luxurious home for the bishop to live in, and an abbey on the side for monks. Right back to the story of Mary's funeral procession. We know the coffin of the executed queen arrived here and was received at the west door of the cathedral at around 2 a.m. in the morning of the 31st of July, 1587. And it was greeted by the bishop, a man named Richard Howland, and the dean and chapter of the cathedral. On top of the coffin was actually a lifelike effigy of Mary, but this has never been found and has actually been lost to time. It's hidden away somewhere in the building behind me. Now, the grave has been dug before, and it was dug by a man named Robert Scarlett, the sexton of the cathedral, who claimed he dug the graves of thousands of people from Peterborough. Old Scarlett, as he was known, also dug Catherine of Aragon's grave too. He was, by his nickname, a rather old man. We must also mention the state of the coffin too. It is known that there were cracks in the lead, and this would have speeded up the decomposition process of her remains, meaning that Mary, especially in the summer heat, may have been rotting very quickly. Not a good smell. Now, shall we go and see the burial site of Mary Queen of Scots? It was right here where the coffin of Mary Queen of Scots was laid to rest in 1587. Now, we must mention that today she isn't buried here. Following the death of Queen Elizabeth and the ascension of Mary's son James I to become the King of England, he had Mary's body taken to Westminster Abbey, where she is buried under a large tomb. When the funeral procession arrived at the cathedral, because of the state of the coffin and remains, she was immediately lowered into the grave, which may have been a burial vault, and the earth was then thrown into the grave, covering her up. The funeral service actually took place after this. So Mary was immediately buried after the procession. There was no ceremony when her body was lowered in there, and only a small opening was left so the staves of office of her household staff could place these broken into the vault. The cost for the grave was allegedly £10, and £20 was spent on the black cloth that decorated this part of the cathedral. Now, let's just mention one thing. The grave of Mary is immediately adjacent to that of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, two Catholic queens buried relatively close. We're also close to the high altar too. It's strange and surreal to think that the body of one of the most famous Tudor women was buried right here. You can actually see on the flooring where the vault was covered over. Following the burial, the funeral did take place. On the next day, the ceremonial state mourners reached Peterborough from London and were entertained in a banquet at the bishop's palace. A huge supper took place in the banqueting hall, which was draped in black cloth. It was said that Her Majesty Elizabeth I wished no expense to be spared, showing Elizabeth probably felt guilty for ordering Mary's execution. On August 1st, the funeral occurred. The effigy of Mary was actually carried into the cathedral from the bishop's palace, and this was ceremonial and meant to represent Mary's body, but of course she had already been buried. Hundreds of officials, poor men and poor women, all gathered into the cathedral. And it was a royal funeral. The effigy was placed over the vault, which was decorated, and the funeral hearse was on top of the vault. There was even a sham coffin too. a fake coffin meant to symbolise Mary being inside to those who did not know she had already been interred. This was richly decorated, and even a gold and jewelled crown was on top of the coffin. Sermons were preached, and it was very emotional. Those officers who had tended to Mary during her imprisonment snapped their staves of office and threw them into the vault as tears fell from their faces. Now, after the funeral, everyone just seemed to depart and make their own ways back to London. But one thing to consider is that Mary was not actually buried inside the cathedral for long. Around 25 years later, her son James I, the new King of England, had her body exhumed and disinterred, and she was then buried inside of Westminster Abbey. She is still there today, in a vault filled with many descendants of her. If Mary Queen of Scots' life had been different, she could have been the Queen of England too, but she met a very rough end. The procession of her coffin from Fotheringhay to Peterborough was a solemn one, especially for someone who had been executed for treason. Most at the time were hanged, drawn and quartered, and their heads were stuck on a spike above London Bridge for the crime. But Mary was different. She was a queen. Truth be told, Queen Elizabeth regretted the execution of Mary. She was her cousin after all, and she was an anointed queen. Elizabeth believed that she would not get into heaven because of the execution, and even on her own deathbed showed remorse and regret. I hope you've enjoyed this video retracing the funeral procession of Mary Queen of Scots. Join us soon for more interesting history like this. Thank you for watching.